People with disabilities have been discriminated by society far before the 1900s. According to the Life Center for Independent Living website, in 1751, states began funding insane asylums and similar institutions to isolate disabled people, who they saw as a burden on society. According to the ADL, people with disabilities were considered unable to contribute to society in ways other than being odd attractions at circuses. This caused the emergence of the public mindset that disabled people must be prevented from entering society. According to Victoria Brignall's article on New Statesman, the U.S. started passing laws in the early 1900s allowing the prevention of disabled people from immigrating into the country, as well as authorizing the sterilization of disabled people against their will. Not only was this considered an effective way of preventing disabled people from entering society, it was also considered an act of mercy.
It wasn't until the presidency of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s and 40s that advocacy for the civil rights of disabled people were first introduced. Presented in the ADL article, as FDR was the first president of the United States with a disability, Roosevelt was one of the first leaders in politics to push for disability rights. Despite Roosevelt's efforts, however, in the time of his presidency, social stigma directed towards disabled people continued to prevail. This meant that substantial progress for the disability movement was yet to emerge. However, the ADL article stated that in the 1940s and 50s, disabled World War II veterans placed an increasing pressure on government to provide them with rehabilitation and vocational training. World War II veterans made disability issues more visible to a country of thankful citizens who were concerned for the long-term welfare of the young men who sacrificed their lives to secure the safety of the United States. However, these veteran efforts, again, failed to bring legislative and social change.
According to Chuck Nguyen on the KALW local public radio website, the disability movement first got its voice when the young college student Ed Roberts sparked an independent living movement on the Berkeley campus. Ed Roberts contracted polio at a young age, which left him quadriplegic, paralyzed in all four limbs. He was initially rejected from UC Berkeley because of his disability, but was later admitted due to an uproar he and his family raised. Roberts was the first man with a significant disability to attend Berkeley. Forced to live in Cowell Hall, the campus hospital, because the dorms were not accessible at the time, Roberts led a union of quadriplegics called the Rolling Quads, which was a disability community set out on spreading disability rights. At Berkeley, the Rolling Quads made the campus wheelchair accessible by getting countertops lowered and bathroom doors widened. The Rolling Quads activism at Berkeley spread nationwide, ultimately creating the nation's first independent living movement.
According to the ADL, by the 1970s, the disability movement culminated into a national effort to bring legislative change for the betterment of disabled Americans. Much like the civil rights movement of '64, disability movement activists conducted sit-ins in front of public buildings, held local protests, and urged the local and state government to pass laws protecting disability rights. Parents of disabled kids had a particularly strong voice, advocating to move their children from institutions and asylums to schools. Their goals were to change the public mindset from viewing disabled people as liabilities unfit for society, eliminate purification and segregation of disabled people, increase access to rehabilitation and vocational training to allow disabled people to live independently, and eliminate discrimination of disabled people in workplaces.
As a result of prominent activism from the disability rights movement, several pieces of legislation were put into effect in the 1970s to establish civil rights for people with disabilities. According to the ADL, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, passed in 1973, prohibits discrimination in employment of federal or federally sponsored programs, as well as requiring that disabled people have equal access to public transportation and housing. Disabled children were later given the right to equal education in 1975, with the passing of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which required that disabled children be fully included in public classes unless their specific disability inhibited them from learning in the same way as other children. Further activism culminated in the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which is comparable to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in that it mandated broad prevention of discrimination of disabled people, just as the CRA prevented discrimination of African Americans. The act required both businesses and public accommodations to provide equal physical access to people with disabilities, as well as prohibiting public transportation and other services from refusing service to people with disabilities.
Recently, the understanding of what a disability is and the struggles that disability people have in society has dramatically evolved. Centers for Independent Living currently recognizes hundreds of different disabilities: progressive disabilities, such as muscular dystrophy; episodic disabilities, such as epilepsy; static, such as amputation; hidden, diabetes; curable, cancer; and perceived, obesity. Currently, the movement aims to reduce prejudice and stereotypes of disabled people by providing services to help disabled people find productive and independently sustainable places in society. The Life Center for Independent Living teaches individuals their rights and the laws that protect those rights so they can advocate for themselves to employers and service providers. Furthermore, they promote public awareness and encourage engagement in public legislation. The original economic justification for the American Disability Act was that the ADA would decrease unemployment of disabled individuals and would ease the burden of the federal government to taxpayers. As of 2015, more than 20% of the disabled population are employed full-time. Compared to historical figures, this employment rate for the disabled population is high, showing a positive impact the ADA had for disabled people.
Social activism and legislation that protects the civil rights of people with disabilities demonstrates to the public that people with disabilities are still people and are undeserving of their historical representation as monsters or mistakes. However, despite the legislative and social changes, the stigma against people with disabilities continues into the 21st century. People with disabilities, such as people with ADHD and autism, still aren't receiving all of the help from legislation that they need to be properly educated. Furthermore, popular culture perpetuates the stigma against people with disabilities by portraying them as unintelligent, violent, or delusional. Activists today are still working to eliminate the negative stigma associated with having disabilities and provide services to help people with disabilities live independently.